Hi Year 7 and welcome to today's lesson, Flowers and Pollination. We're now moving away from human reproduction and we're going to spend the next few lessons looking at plant reproduction and how plants reproduce. So, big thinking question for today's lesson is why do you think some plants have colourful flowers but others don't? So, how are flowers pollinated? Do you know anything about flower pollination? Do you suffer from hay fever? Why does your hay fever turn up on days like today, which is quite bad for hay fever? Have you heard your parents talk about pollen? Do you know what bees do, for example? Have a think. Can you write down anything you know about flowers and pollination? Pause the video now and write down anything you know about flowers and pollination, or even just flower or plant reproduction. Okay, hopefully you've done that. Let's jump into the lesson. So, this is a picture of a common flower and all the different parts of a common flower. Might be nice if you can go outside and find a flower after this lesson and see if you can take it apart and see if you can find these different structures in a flower. But what I want you to do is to learn and memorize these 8 different structures in a flower, because in 2 minutes time, or if you pause the video, give yourself 2 minutes to learn it, and then you're going to test yourself and see if you can remember all these different parts to a flower. So pause the video, give yourself 2 minutes and memorize the structures of this flower. Okay, hopefully you've memorized these different parts to the flower. Let's jump in and see how well you write A to H and then write down the answers of the different parts of the flower. So write A to H, pause the video and write down the different parts of the flower. Okay, let's see how many you got right in a score of 1 to 8. Give yourself a score of 1 to 8. And there they are. A is the petal, the outside of the flower. B is the anther. C is the filament. D was the receptacle. E was the ovary. F, sepal. G, the style. And H, the stigma. But I know you're asking, what are all these bits of a flower? I'm sure you know what a petal is, but do you really know what the other bits of a flower are? Probably not. And so we're going to jump in and have a look at what each of these parts of the flower actually does. What is their function? What do they do for the flower? So, if we're looking at the flower, I know this diagram is slightly different, but it has exactly the same bits to the flower. So if we start with the stamen. So the stamen is the male reproductive part of a flower. So flowers, unlike humans, they have both male and female sexual organs or sexual reproductive organs. So on a flower, the male parts of the reproductive system are called the stamen. Okay, and it's got 2 parts to it. It's got the anther, which produces the pollen, which is the male gamete. So pollen is the plant version of a sperm cell. So you've got the anther, which produces the pollen, and then you've got the filament, which holds up the anther. So those are the 2 main parts of the male reproductive system in a flower, the stamen. Okay, if we then jump over to the female reproductive system of a flower, and it's the carpels. The carpel is the female reproductive system of the flower, and it contains 3 main things. The stigma. Now, this is sticky to catch grains of pollen. So imagine it like Velcro and the sticky part of the Velcro. That's what the stigma is. Its job is there to catch the pollen either out of the air or off other insects, and we'll talk about that in another lesson. You've then got the style. Now the style holds up the stigma. So its main job is to hold up the stigma, and then the ovary, which contains the ovules or the female gamete. So that's basically the egg. Okay, it contains the egg. just like in a female reproductive system. So where is the pollen made? It's made in the anther, which is part of the stamen, the male reproductive system. So there's different types of pollination. So the idea behind pollination is that plants want to get their pollen to a different plant. Okay, so flower A wants to get its pollen to flower B. It can't just pass its pollen to itself. Okay, plants need to pass their pollen from one plant to another plant. So there's two main ways that flowers pass their pollen from each other. The first main way is by wind. These are called wind-pollinated flowers. Now, adaptations basically means how has the plant changed in order to perform this function better? So how are these flowers better at passing their pollen from each other using the wind? And the main thing is that this pollen is really light. It's very lightweight, so it can be carried really far by the wind and stay in the air longer. And therefore, it gives itself a better chance of finding a different flower and being caught by the stigma. So that's the first type, wind-pollinated flowers. The second type is insect-pollinated flowers. So insect-pollinated flowers, basically they attract insects. The insect will land on the flower, and then the pollen will stick to that insect. It will then travel to another plant of the same type, and then the pollen that's stuck to it will then get caught by the other flower and trapped, and that's how the pollen gets passed along. This is called cross-pollination. So cross-pollination is when pollen from one flower is used to fertilize a different flower of the same type. So see how there's two different yellow flowers on this slide? They're the same type, but they're different. Just like you've got two different boys. They're two different boys, but they're the same species, same type. They're both human males. Okay, it's the same thing here. Okay, they're both flowers, but in this case, they both got male and female sex organs. So, can you have a go, please, now for me? It's the last task this lesson. Can you write these sentences down? And then, can you use the words from the side in that box in order to fill in the blanks? So, pause this video, copy down the sentences, and fill in the blanks. Have a go, pause the video, and do this now. Okay, let's go through the answers now together. You should have written these down and worked them out yourselves. So flowers have a stamen and a carpel that are the male and female reproductive parts to the flower. The stamen contains anthers, which produce pollen and filaments. The carpel contains stigmas, styles, and ovaries that carry ovules. A pollen grain from the anther fertilizes the ovule. Pollination is the transfer of pollen to an ovule. So the transfer of pollen from one plant to another. And then pollen grains have adaptations based on how they are pollinated by either insects or the wind. Hope you've enjoyed today's lesson and completed all the tasks. As always, remember to stay safe and take care.